Lots of people have a problem area like this, that little narrow passage between the kitchen extension and next door's garden wall that you never know quite what to do with. But here the problem's even worse because it's not a garden wall, it's 10 foot of pebble dash extension and it faces north, so this bit gets absolutely no light at all. The couple who live here are very keen on their garden and they've tried all sorts, but there is one plus. The door from the kitchen is at this end of the extension, so they don't actually need access to this area, and that means we can fill it with lush, jungly, shade-loving plants and create a real little corner of Eden. It's amazing the things they come up with for gardens these days, and there's this new thing for covering the drainage hole in the bottom of pots. This is it. Oh, all right, then it's a used tea bag, but it's actually jolly good because it lets the water out, but it keeps the compost in. Now, for my crock layer, I'm going to use some broken up polystyrene seed tray. It's light, cheap, widely available, and it does the job. But the plants are going to be in these containers for quite a long time, so they need a compost with some real guts to it. And we're using this stuff. This is the Rolls Royce of compost. It's earthworm-digested farmyard manure with additional nutrients in it. And the only thing I've added is a couple of spoonfuls of this stuff. This is a water-retaining gel, and it's astonishing. This, believe it or not, is one of those small spoonfuls in a pint of water. So you can see how much water it holds, and that'll stop the compost drying out too quickly. We decided on terracotta pots here because they blend so beautifully with the house bricks. And we particularly like this pale French terracotta because obviously in a dark, shady corner, anything light is a real help. Yes, they are expensive. So if you're on a tight budget, there are some very good plastic imitations around now. A lot of people think the false castor oil plant, Fatsia japonica, is a house plant, but in fact it's very hardy, and it's a smashing plant for a shady spot like this. Now, it has these enormous, shiny, evergreen leaves, but they're very, very thin, and that's because it's just a single layer of chlorophyll spread over a wide area to make the most of what little light there is to manufacture the food it needs. If you look at plants in the wild, you'll find that those at the edge of a woodland, where there's more light, are smaller and fatter than those further in. And that's because there's absolutely no point in a leaf having layers and layers of chlorophyll if there's only enough light to penetrate one layer. The fact that they're glossy is important too, because it means they reflect the available light onto each other. And ivy is another smashing plant for shade. It has similar glossy, thin leaves, and in fact the reason it climbs is to seek the light. If you look at ivy climbing up a tree or on a wall, when it gets to the top, it changes habit completely. It's like another plant. The stems become woody instead of clinging, the leaves get larger and they change shape, and it flowers. Hostas and Aucuba japonica, the spotted laurel, are also good in shade for the same reason. While the thin, papery leaves of this bamboo, it used to be called a rundinaria, but now it's Fargesia nitida, are in fact adapted to the high altitude where it grows in the wild. The sun makes them curl up at the edges a bit, so it's happier in shade. We've gone mainly for evergreen foliage so that it looks good all year round, with just a few flowers for a splash of summer colour. Mainly white, which really does gleam in shade. Isn't it amazing what you can do with a bit of off-the-peg trellis and a few plants? Everything's really grown like mad. The evergreens have got this lovely new foliage on, and the rose, the climbing iceberg here. Oh, that's lovely. It's really flowering its little heart out. And the hostas are absolutely beautiful. Look at this, not a slug hole in sight. And the secret of success is Vaseline smeared around the top of the pot here. See? They really don't like it, and they don't crawl across it. Although this is a very shady little tunnel and it faces due north, it's actually looking much brighter here now too. The glossy foliage helps, but most of all it's these lovely pale creamy Cotswold chippings. They really do bounce the light back, and of course that helps the plants. Well, it's only a couple of months since we put all these plants in, but already it's beginning to look really beautiful, and we're on the way to achieving that little corner of paradise we set out to achieve.
Richard, why do you think there has been this great resurgence of interest in ferns? Well, I can give you one good reason. Everybody seems to have a position in the garden that nothing else will grow. And I can honestly say I can find you a hardy fern that will grow in that.
What, even in, say, dry shade?
Dry shade, moist shade, shade being the optimum condition, certainly by the side of a hedge, under trees.
Well, that is very good news as far as I'm concerned. And also, of course, they do look pretty good too, don't they?
Yes, yeah. You have all the different leaf textures and forms.
What sort of thing would you suggest that we grew in dry shade?
Dry shade, any of the Dryopteris varieties, Polypodium and the Splenum varieties, they will all tolerate dry shade.
Now, Dryopteris, that's the one they call the male fern, isn't it? But it's not really male.
No, it's not. There's also a variety they call the lady fern, and that's the Ethereums. And a lot of people say, do you need a male and female in the garden to produce babies? You don't. Not in the fern world, anyway.
Now, Dryopteris filix mass, that's the one that we see all over the country. But it seems to be the only one. Now, why is that?
Well, I think it all happened in the Victorian time, and the craze was that they just went around stripping the countryside of ferns, and we now just don't see the varieties around anymore.
And that really is a good lesson for us too, isn't it? We really must stop doing it. OK, Richard, well, that's dry shade. Now, what about moist shade?
Moist shade, Ethereums, the Osmundas, the royal fern, very popular, can get up to around about 6 foot to 10 feet it grown in the right condition.
That must look splendid.
Yes, but it must have moisture, plenty of moisture.
And these are Ethereums?
These are the Ethereums, yes. They will also grow in moist shade as well, shade being the optimum criteria.
Well, there's one fern here that I've got to ask you about, this one.
Yes.
It's a beauty, isn't it?
Ethereum niponicum pictum, the Japanese painted fern. Very popular, a very pretty fern actually in the garden.
What about this one then? This you couldn't wish for anything here which is more delicate than that.
No, that's Ethereum plumosum, very pretty fern.
I must say I'm really pleased to have those ferns now to solve what is probably the biggest problem in my garden. You may remember this area. It's shaded by a huge tree and by hedges all round, and the soil is the worst in the whole garden. And a couple of weeks ago I was working on the soil, improving the drainage by digging in lots of coarse grit and adding bulky organic matter at the same time. Well, that's raised the level of the soil quite a lot, so I'm sure that's improved the drainage a lot, and it now should be okay. What I've done now is just to put in this little access path with chipped bark, and I've started planting my ferns. Because of the roots of the tree, this is likely to be the driest and darkest spot of the whole lot. So that's just the place for this little fella here, the common polypody. Now this one will grow almost anywhere in the driest old place, and it will actually colonise too, and I think that'll look rather good. Another group of ferns that will also do well are the Dryopteris, like the broad buckler fern here. That really likes it a little bit moister, so I've brought it a little bit further away from the tree. And it's much the same story with the relatives of the male fern. All those will do quite well in dry or wet conditions. And the same thing with the Aspleniums, the hart's tongue fern, for example. And how about this lovely little one down here, which looks really nice? They'll do perfectly okay in dryish soil, provided you get them off to a good start. That really is essential. So once you've planted them, you must give them a really good water in, and then come back, certainly for the next year, and just keep an eye on them and make sure that they never dry out. And once you've done that too, it will pay to mulch them over the top with a bit of fine bark like this, and that will really settle them in nicely and set them off well too, of course. Now, one fern that you knew jolly well I wasn't going to be able to resist is the Japanese painted fern. But this one must have a moist situation. So I'm going to plant this one well away from the tree. That will go in here, in this soil, which is still quite moist, of course. is not necessarily entirely hardy, so if we have a really cold winter, I shall stick a lantern cloche on top of that. And I think this will look rather good. Now I'm looking for some flower, and one group of plants that will provide that are the geraniums. Now, I don't mean this sort of geranium that you will buy in the garden centre right now. That would look very much out of place in this position too, I think. What I mean are the relatives of our native cranesbills. This one is Geranium himalayense, and it'll have these beautiful blue flowers over a long period during the season. And it'll grow into a really big mound shape and fill quite a big space here. That one is very suited to dry soil and shade. But you mustn't expect with any of these real warriors to be able to do that from infancy. The soil here, well, you can see, is really terrible stuff. So what I'm doing is to dig it out and to replace it with a bucket full of decent soil that I've dug out from the garden, mixed it with a bit of compost, and that'll give it a really good start. The other thing that you must not do is ever to plant a dry plant. Not with any plants, and particularly in this situation. So always water plants before you plant them and get that root ball really moist. And then, it's going to love that. Now this is adapted to dry conditions, but again, don't expect it to be able to do it right from the start. So water it in well, and for the first year at least, come back and make jolly sure that it doesn't dry out. And then after that, it should look out for itself. Now, there are all sorts of other colours in geraniums. This one, for example, is a much closer relative of our native Geranium pratense. This one is called Silver Queen, and it has these lovely lilac flowers over a long period, and again, it'll spread to cover quite a large area. The barrenworts like slightly moister soil, so I've pulled those out a little bit further away from the tree, and these are grown largely for their beautiful leaves. They get much bigger than this when they're established, so I've got some growing in another part of the garden which are looking really handsome, and they've got good autumn colour too, and also flowers in the early spring, something like this high, and this one, Epimedium rubrum, has red flowers. There's one over at the back there, Epimedium youngii, which has yellow flowers. So again, you've got lots of choice. Now, oh, hello, Dennis. He loves rolling in this mulch here. It's a very good idea when you're choosing plants to look at the sort of conditions that they like in the wild. And we've all seen brambles, blackberries, that sort of thing, growing right on the edge of woodland and in hedgerows and things. Well, this one is a relative of our bramble. This is Rubus benenden, and so I've pulled this right away from the shade of the tree just to give it some dappled shade, and that one will have these huge dog roses on it for quite a while, and that will grow to 6 to 9 feet. That'll look terrific.
Shaded areas often have a lot of problems associated with growing plants. The reduced light level means that plants grow much more slowly, particularly variegated ones. And trees like this magnolia take a lot of moisture out of the ground, particularly during the summer months, and that can make young plants underneath difficult to establish. Trees will also rob a lot of nutrients, and so when you're feeding young plants, you almost have to feed the plant and the tree. And every autumn, they'll deposit their leaves, and some plants don't like that. This bed used to be planted with wood sedge, which grows particularly well here underneath the shade of the trees. But it's a tall and dense plant, and it covers up the base of the magnolia tree, which I wanted to see. So I've ripped the wood sedge out, and I've also uncovered all these beautiful limestone rocks, which have these wonderful fissures in them. And that has now given me the opportunity to plant some more interesting shade-loving plants. The bed's on 2 different levels, which presents 2 different planting opportunities. The upper level tends to get dry during the summer months, with the tree taking a lot of moisture out of the soil. So any plant that we put here has to be drought tolerant. So I've put in a number of evergreens, like the variegated euonymus, which will grow slowly in amongst the rocks, but retain its variegated foliage throughout the year. There's also Pachysandra right at the base of the tree, and this is a particularly good plant for a dry, shaded area. It will grow slowly and take perhaps a couple of years to fill this space, but when it does, it'll stop the weeds from coming through. At the lower level of the bed, there are plants that require more moisture. There's the familiar hostas and also some ferns. Particularly, I like the polystichum with its young foliage, a beautiful bronzy red colour. It's important that these plants don't dry out during the dry summer months, so I'm going to have to water them in well until they're established. Some shade-loving plants are equally at home in both moist or dry soils, like these low-growing evergreens. I've selected these because colour in a shaded area is particularly important during the winter months, and these are evergreen, so they'll hold their foliage throughout the year. They're both slow-growing. The black-leaved Ophiopogon is wonderful against this yellow-leaved Acorus grass, and they all grow very slowly and form a nice tidy clump. I've also planted some stinking iris, which is aptly named because the flowers that appear in June are foul-smelling. But I've mainly grown it for its strong, upright dark green foliage and its fruits, which are bright scarlet berries, and they appear at the end of the summer and last all the way through the autumn until the winter. But a word of warning, they are poisonous, so watch out if you've got young children. At this time of year, once you've selected your plants, it's important to get them in the ground as soon as possible. The soil underneath trees can be particularly dry during the summer months, so I always like to put water in the bottom of the planting hole. Don't forget to firm the plant in well and mulch with organic matter, which will help to retain that valuable moisture. And finally, water it in thoroughly.
If a friend was to offer you a lungwort to plant in your garden, you could be forgiven for being a bit suspicious of their motives. And that would be a pity, because the Pulmonarias, or lungworts, are a group of hardy, spring-flowering perennials that are perfect for almost any size of garden. Very accommodating plants, growing in sun or shade where it's not too dry. Not all Pulmonarias have spotted leaves. In fact, Angustifolia, which is a very early flowering species, doesn't. This has dark green leaves, which more or less die back in winter. This is Red Start, and I think it's one of the best. It starts as early as January and continues all the way through until May. One group, known as the Jerusalem cowslip, the species officinalis, has produced some marvellous forms. One of my favourites is Pulmonaria Sissinghurst white, whose delicate combination of white flowers with silvery spotted leaves is a delight in the spring garden. This Pulmonaria in particular, I think one couldn't fault. It has this wonderful show of flowers at this time of year going on for weeks, and then that's followed again later on by spotted leaves. But I'm saving two of the best until last. These are commonly listed under the Longifolia group, which means long, narrow leaves. But who knows the secrets of what their true parentage is? One was raised in England and named after that great old English gardener, Bertram Anderson. This has deep blue flowers and silvery spotted leaves. And Roy Davison, named after the American who found it, which seems slightly more vigorous and makes a strong clump of leaves, spotted with silver and pale blue flowers.
Now, in early summer, these trees are in full leaf. So not only are they casting this part of the garden into very dense shade, they're acting as an umbrella. They're keeping all the rain off. And of course their roots are sucking what little moisture there is out of the soil. So the net result is this part of the garden is very, very dry. Add to that the fact that the basic soil around here is very, very free draining and sandy anyway. And this is what you wind up with. Horrible, lumpy dust. Now all plants need light and moisture in order to do well. But there's a long list of those that'll cope with very little light, provided they have plenty of moisture. Where there's little light and little moisture, though, the list is much shorter. But one of the joys of gardening, of course, is that nothing is impossible. To let more light into this area, I've thinned out the lower branches of this tree quite a lot, and it's already making quite a lot of difference. Now, to tackle the problem of the dryness in the soil, I'm digging in lots of bulky organic matter. I'm actually using composted bark, but you could just as well use composted straw, or if you can get it, well-rotted farmyard manure. Quite a few of the plants that'll do well in a situation like this have glossy evergreen leaves, things like the sarcococca, Christmas box, which has the most deliciously scented vanilla flowers in the winter. Good old tough Euphorbia robii, which will grow where practically nothing else will. And of course the euonymus, good tough little plant that does well in lots of difficult situations. The fact that these leaves are glossy means that they reflect the light onto each other, and that makes the most of what little light they get. That gloss also acts as a sort of protective coating on the leaf to help keep moisture in. Now, the fact that these keep their leaves in the winter means that when the leaves aren't on the trees, they get a lot more light, and so they can manufacture the food they need then to see them through the rest of the year. Some ferns are superbly adapted for this sort of situation, provided it's not too dry. The fronds are really broad, so they make the most of what light's available. But they're so finely divided that the actual surface area of the leaf isn't really that large, so they don't lose very much moisture. The fact that they don't produce flowers or fruit also means that the plant's energies can go purely into making these beautiful fronds. It's lovely, that, isn't it? It's one of my favourites. Very few flowering plants that grow in these conditions in the wild will actually flower in the middle of the summer. They either flower late, when there's a bit more moisture about, like the beautiful Liriope muscari here, or they flower early, before they have to compete with the trees for light and moisture. And so we've put in quite a few spring flowering perennials, things like the lovely Pulmonarias, the lungworts here. But of course most spring colour comes from bulbs, and I'm going to put in quite a lot of those.
This is a whole load of slug fodder. And yet, if you look around, there's not a hole in a leaf anywhere. Here is a man with a secret. Now, Richard, how do you do it?
Well, there's many ways, but the most important is to be vigilant and to actually watch for the appearance of slugs or their damage.
Well, the place is immaculately clean. That's important, isn't it?
It is, of course. We want to remove any surplus vegetation, any plant debris where the slugs can hide. Where we do get specific plants affected by slugs, we will come out with the torch, find the offenders and remove them.
What about natural allies?
This is very important to us, and we do rely very heavily on large frog populations here in the tunnels, and also hedgehogs are good slug predators as well.
I see that all the plants in here are grown in pots. Do you think that makes a difference?
Well, all of these plants are for sale or for exhibition, and it is particularly important, whether exhibiting them or selling them, that the leaves are free of holes caused by slug damage.
Could you recommend some slug-free
Yes, certainly.
Or slug resistant, let's say.
Well,
Right.
relatively resistant, yes. Obviously, those varieties which have much thicker, less palatable leaves and much taller stems are very much better because the slugs find it more difficult to access those plants and also more difficult to eat the leaves. Varieties I have in mind are like this Hosta crosser regal, but many people prefer the variegated varieties like this Hosta Francis Williams or a newer introduction, this Hosta Great Expectations.
A lot of people turn up their noses at the plain green-leaved varieties, but you've got one down here which I think is an absolute knockout.
We find, particularly with the exhibition stands, it's essential to mix some of the, as you put it, slightly more plain-leaf varieties with the more colourful ones, and it does give a very much more restful effect if you do this.
That one has lovely big leaves, and what is it?
This is an amazing variety. It will grow enormous. It's Hosta summon substance, and this, I think, is virtually slug-proof.
And now, of course, every nurseryman wants to think that all his plants are good, but there are some that are very prone, aren't there?
Oh, this is inevitable, and I think it's very often the older varieties that are more prone, like the well-known Thomas Hogg and the undulator varieties with their wavy-edged leaves, and these tend to be the ones which are the most easily purchased.
However unpromising it may seem, if you've got a bit of soil, you can make yourself a garden and brighten up your life. How about this for an awkward site? It was the dingy backyard of a basement flat in London. It's got a steep slope on it and it faces north, so it gets very little light. Believe me, the sight from the kitchen window was nothing if not depressing. But with a little bit of thought and a lot of determination, it's been transformed into something that really lifts the spirits. It was designed to be viewed either from the kitchen window or from up there where the camera is. And the idea was to create a tapestry of muted flower and foliage colours, really something that would more or less resemble the forest floor. The plants have been planted cleverly, so the contrast in foliage is quite apparent. Now, look at the broad leaves of these hostas and the way that they will contrast with the spiky foliage of the New Zealand flax here, and the spotted leaves of this Pulmonaria. Where there is no light at all, they've used good old ivy, because that will grow almost anywhere. There's very little here in the way of flower, and what there is all in pastel colours. Things like the whites of the tobacco plant there and the blue of the bellflowers. And they've also used hydrangeas. Remember that those will grow very much better in semi-shade than they will in sunshine, and of course ferns will grow almost anywhere. So now, instead of a dingy old London backyard, there's a little touch of the English countryside.